The French Riviera comes to Frankston, about 20 miles from Melbourne, in the form of paddle boats that are now popular throughout the world. Designed to carry two people, the boats are really bicycles on flukes, and they're called, aptly enough, pedalos. You ride them like a bike, except that you recline at ease while you do it. The paddle itself is elevated above the bottom of the float so the craft can beach easily. Like the idea? Let's try it then.
And try it they did, although patrons of Melbourne's Bay beaches couldn't have cared less if the new novelty craft had a French connection or not. But many local beachgoers will certainly recall riding in the odd-shaped paddle boats. Just one of any number of reasons why for more than 100 years Victorians have formed a very strong attachment to their bay, Port Phillip Bay. For overseas visitors to Melbourne at the beginning of the 20th century, the sea was the only road. And for visiting dignitaries, the chosen point of arrival in Port Phillip Bay was not Port Melbourne, but St Kilda, which had enjoyed the warmth of ministerial favour as preferred landing site since 1895. Many of the welcoming ceremonies at St Kilda Pier from this era were recorded and survive on film. In fact, one of the earliest and surprisingly well-preserved Australian films in the National Collection is the official coverage of the royal visit by the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York in May 1901. This was no ordinary royal visit. The Duke and Duchess, later King George V and Queen Mary, were here to open Australia's first federal parliament at Melbourne's Exhibition Building. Alighting from the newly painted paddle steamer Hygeia, the Duke and Duchess were welcomed by the official party, including the Earl of Hopetoun, our first Governor-General. After inspecting a Victorian colonial artillery brigade, the Duke and his entourage slowly made their way down a long red carpet towards waiting carriages. At the pier entrance, large crowds had gathered to greet the royal couple. From the single-camera vantage point, a glimpse of the St Kilda sea baths and the temporary commemorative arch constructed over the pier by members of the St Kilda Sailing Club for this special occasion. 20 years later, Edward, the Prince of Wales and son of George V, arrived at Port Melbourne, but only for transshipping from HMAS Anzac. Again, the official welcome would be conducted at St Kilda, and again, the Hygeia would serve as the royal conveyance to the pier. A range of pleasure craft was on hand, waiting in anticipation for the Prince's arrival. This was the start of a comprehensive national tour for the Prince of Wales. Here is the King's representative to thank Australians for their role in the First World War. After meeting the Governor-General, the Prime Minister, Federal and State Ministers, and inspecting the Australian Navy and Army Guards of Honour, the Prince, like his father before him, made his way along the pier towards a bevy of local government officials. As the party leaves the pier, the ornate entrance to the St Kilda Baths can be seen in the background. The pattern of royal landings in Melbourne was repeated 7 years later with the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of York. The future King George VI disembarked at Port Melbourne for transfer to the royal barge. No Hygeia this time. All in readiness, meanwhile, for the Duke's official welcome at St Kilda. And a new touch, army planes flying over in formation. By 1927, the National Parliament had moved from Melbourne to the new federal capital, and the main purpose of this tour was for the Duke to open the first session of Parliament in Canberra. At the St Kilda Pier, he was greeted by the Governor-General, Lord Stonehaven, who in turn introduced the Duke and Duchess to other official guests, including the Prime Minister, Stanley Melbourne Bruce, who doffs his top hat. After inspecting the military guards of honour, the Duke rejoined his young wife Elizabeth on the walkway for introduction to federal and state ministers and other officials. The Prime Minister, gloves in hand, looks on uneasily. As the introductions proceeded and the camera continued to roll, an onlooker wandered into view and received a hasty rap on the arm for his trouble. In a less than groundbreaking address of welcome, the Mayor of St Kilda, Councillor Bernard Gray, informed the royal couple that on this spot, Their Majesties the King and Queen and the Prince of Wales had been similarly greeted by local officialdom. But St Kilda missed out on boasting rights with the arrival of the next royal visitor. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, the third son of King George V to visit Australia, arrived at Port Melbourne on the 18th of October 1934. Greeting him was Sir Isaac Isaacs, the first Australian-born Governor-General. Prime Minister Joseph Lyons was also part of the official party to greet the Duke, here to officially open Melbourne's centenary celebrations. Finally, Port Melbourne residents had something to cheer about, enjoying first-hand views of the Duke as he departed Prince's Pier in horse-drawn carriage. But royal landings aside, St Kilda had also hosted its share of welcoming ceremonies for other VIPs over the years. Lord Denman commenced his term of office as Australia's Governor-General at the end of July 1911 and, accompanied by his wife, was filmed by the Pathé news cameraman on arrival in Melbourne. Lord Denman's successor was Sir Ronald Munro Ferguson, and his arrival in Melbourne was also filmed. The Ports and Harbours steam launch, SS Plover, ferried Sir Ronald and other dignitaries to the St Kilda Pier for the official landing in May 1914. Waiting to greet them on the pier proper was the Prime Minister Joseph Cook and members of his cabinet. No red carpet running the length of the pier or commemorative arch at the entrance for the new Governor-General, but the occasion was otherwise consistent with viceregal welcoming ceremonies at St Kilda. A welcome by the Mayor, Councillor Edward O'Donnell. Assembled school children eager to cheer and wave their caps as the King's representative approached. And crowds gathered around the pier entrance as the Governor-General and his aides entered the waiting landau to take them to Parliament House for the swearing-in ceremony. Viceregal duties in the Bayside area often extended beyond the official welcomes. On the 15th of May 1921, for example, the then Governor-General, Lord Forster, presented St Kilda City Council certificates to about 1,500 nurses, soldiers, sailors and family members of fallen men, all St Kilda residents, at a special ceremony on the lower esplanade. Governors-General were also called upon to conduct numerous opening ceremonies, particularly in the years following the First World War. Typical of these was the Soldiers' Memorial Hall in Waltham Street, Sandringham, officially declared open by Lord Stonehaven on Armistice Day in 1925. Patriotic fervour was running high after the war. Again, the people of Melbourne turned out in force to welcome the retired Lord High Admiral of the British Fleet, Lord Jellicoe, and his wife. The first Sea Lord was visiting Australia in May 1919 to report on naval defence, en route to filling the office of the governorship of New Zealand. Lord and Lady Jellicoe were greeted on landing at St Kilda by high-ranking naval officers. After the obligatory inspection of the Naval Guard of Honour by the First Sea Lord, local schoolgirls eventually got a chance to wave their flags as the distinguished visitors headed their way. In the same year, another enthusiastic crowd gathered at St Kilda for the homecoming of the celebrated First World War commander Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, accompanied by his daughter Bertha and his wife Hannah Victoria, who was struck by a misdirected bunch of flowers. Monash was returning from his post as Australia's Director General of Repatriation and Demobilisation in London. He and his family were greeted at the pier by army officers and other well-wishers, before listening to the mayoral address of welcome. On the 19th of May 1924, the arrival of an RAAF Fairy 3D seaplane showed there was more than one way to make an impressive landing at St Kilda. Crowd anticipation grew as the seaplane came into view, landed perfectly, and taxied towards the foreshore. While parts of the crowd lingered to inspect the seaplane, now secured on the beach, the majority of onlookers formed an excited circle around the two aviators on the pier. Wing Commander S.J. Goebel and Flight Officer I.E. McIntyre were carried aloft in triumph, pausing only for press photographers to capture the spontaneous outburst of feeling. Goebel and McIntyre had just completed the first round Australia flight in the seaplane, having departed from Point Cook early in April to investigate coastal and interior facilities for both defence and civil purposes. For new Victorian Governor Lord Huntingfield, however, it was back to the more formal landing ceremony at St Kilda. The temporary arch, the assembled school children, lots of flag waving, and so on. Lord Huntingfield arrived in Melbourne in May 1934 to take up the duties of the King's representative. For the Governor's journey to Parliament House, a chauffeured motor vehicle rather than horse-drawn carriage was now the preferred mode of transport. And by the time of Sir Dallas Brooke's appointment as Victorian Governor in 1949, Port Melbourne was the preferred point of arrival, and for departure as well. After a record second term of office, Sir Dallas was farewelled at Station Pier by Premier Bolte and other well-wishers, before leaving Australia with Lady Brooks on the passenger liner Iberia in April 1963. Increasingly, though, important visitors to Melbourne were now arriving by air rather than by sea, and for official welcomes, airports were replacing piers. But the bay could still provide forums for royal visitors, if not perhaps with quite the same degree of precision and formality as in the past.
Out on Port Phillip Bay this afternoon, it was gusty but colourful. Melbourne's boating fraternity turned out in force to see the Prince and Princess take part in the bay play activities. The first royal duty was to get the 2,000 fun runners off their mark along Beaconsfield Parade. Then it was down to Station Pier to board the Port Authority Vessel Commissioner for what was to be a leisurely cruise to Point Ormond. During the cruise, the Prince and Princess were to see a combined land, sea and air spectacular planned especially for Victoria's 150th birthday celebrations. But more than 1,000 craft flooded into the area to get a glimpse of the royal pair, creating a nightmare for water police. At one stage, chaos seemed to prevail. Near misses became the order of the day, as boats rounded the Commissioner for a chance at a royal wave in unrehearsed style. Then the media boat had its own close call. The yachts detoured in front of official boats, some coming a little too close for comfort, but the royal couple smiled on regardless.
Most Australians regard the beach experience as a national birthright, and this is especially the case for the more than 3 million people who now encircle Port Phillip. In the 19th century, homesick visitors dreamed of Blackpool, penny arcades, deck chairs and Devonshire teas. But the combination of hot summers, blue skies and long coastlines ensured that English beach protocols would not necessarily translate to the young colony. The earliest surviving footage of inner Bay beach scenes, taken at St Kilda in 1912, reveals the transition from an essentially passive to a more robust beach culture. While St Kilda at this time offered the features of a British seaside resort, including a rotunda and a pier and esplanade for promenading and taking in the fresh sea breezes, a lot of beachgoers were more than content to stroll along the shoreline in their Sunday best. While others enjoyed the pleasures of open bathing with family and friends. And as swimming, rather than passive bathing, became more popular, it was inevitable that the precocious talent developed by local youths would translate into competitions, carnivals, and the formation of clubs. An early newsreel captures scenes from the first beach carnival held in February 1914 by the Open Sea Bathing Club, a forerunner of the Albert Park Lifesaving Club. Formed only 1 month earlier for the purpose of promoting lifesaving classes, the club quickly attracted 250 members, male and female, most of whom participated in some way in the first carnival. The events were staged at the section of beach to the west of Victoria Avenue, near Stubbs Baths. For the 100 yards race, a handsome trophy was sponsored by Ducks Picture Theatres. But from the camera operator's vantage point, pinpointing the leading swimmer in the choppy conditions was no easy task. The inaugural winner was A.H. Howlett, and the winner of the best character in the novelty event, H. Schilling. The majority of Australia's finest swimmers, however, developed their art not in the open water, but at public sea baths, long before chlorinated pools were built. The confines of the baths offered not just guides to water depth and protection against feared shark attack, but for competition purposes, the sea baths also provided readily measurable courses. Women's swimming received an early boost from the legendary Annette Kellerman. Known as the $1 Million Mermaid, Kellerman was brought up in Mentone, and it's claimed she appeared in some exhibition swims at Middle Brighton. Dual Olympian Judy Joy Davies learned to swim at Middle Brighton Baths. She had her first formal lessons at the age of 8, and by 12 was representing Victoria in the national championships. Champion distance swimmer and Olympic medalist John Marshall also came out of the Baths programs to dominate his freestyle events after World War II. One of Victoria's and Australia's first genuine star swimmers was Ivan Stedman. Here the newsreel cameras record his victory in the 440-yard state championship at the Williamstown Sea Baths in 1921. As swimming became more popular, competition to run championship events was fierce. For many years, annual state titles were conducted at various venues at different times, not staged at one pool as is the case now. Stedman remains the only swimmer to have won the sprint freestyle title and an Australian breaststroke championship in the same year. But the Victorian swimmer who truly captured the public imagination in this era was Frank Beaurepaire. At 15, he was already collecting state titles. In December 1910, after winning 51 successive races at home and abroad, Beaurepaire returned from overseas to a huge civic reception at the Melbourne Town Hall. Beaurepaire was big news, and especially in his hometown. A day later, the cameras recorded the champion swimmers meeting with William Henry, founder of the Royal Lifesaving Society of London. Among a host of other lifetime achievements, Beaurepaire was at the heart of Melbourne's ultimately successful bid to stage the Olympic Games in 1956. and was also responsible for thousands of Victorian children learning how to swim, proposing and launching a far-reaching swimming proficiency campaign in association with the Herald newspaper. Ironically, Beaurepair's initial appointment as a school's organiser for swimming in 1911 infringed his amateur status and led to a 9-year break in his swimming career. He returned to competitive swimming early in 1920, his comeback coinciding with the reintroduction of the national championships after the war and the visit of American star Norman Ross. Beaurepaire lost to Ross by the narrowest margin in the 220 yards freestyle event, as these rare, decomposing images reveal. The American visitor was also billed to swim in 3 Victorian Championship carnivals in 1920. The first of these took place at the St Kilda Baths early in February, in front of a huge crowd. A fancy diving display by Sergeant Leveson was diverting, but what the locals had flocked to see was the clash between Ross and Beaurepaire in the half-mile title event. Beaurepaire led early, and despite the regular surf running inside the baths on this afternoon, seemed unperturbed by the difficult conditions. Not so his American rival, who finished a distant second, and in so doing suffered his first defeat for 4 years. 1920 was also the year in which Frank Beaurepaire transferred to the powerful Melbourne Swimming Club, whose club rooms were based at the St Kilda Baths until 1970. For many years, the Melbourne Club had by far the highest membership of any club affiliated with the Victorian Amateur Swimming Association, and its swimming carnivals were always well-attended affairs. While membership numbers dipped and most senior competition was suspended during the war years, the news of the Olympic Games coming to Melbourne provided a huge boost to the club after the war. Since its inception in 1894-95, the Melbourne Club has also been involved in water polo competition, and now survives solely as a water polo club after amalgamating with Old Wesley Collegians in 1976. The Bayside Sea Baths, of course, weren't confined to swimming clubs, their members or their competitions. Because of the 19th century ban on swimming in the open sea during daylight hours, bathers were compelled to keep within baths enclosures. And given the much touted curative properties of salt water, it wasn't long before people from Melbourne and from all over the colony flocked to the sea baths. From the 1860s, men and women had a choice of up to 5 establishments at St Kilda, and in time, a further 5 along the beach between St Kilda and Port Melbourne. The most famous of these was Captain Kenny's Bathing Ship Baths, patronised by local bathers for almost 60 years. By the time these pictures were taken in 1917, the captain's whaling brig, the Nancy, had long disappeared, and Kenny's Baths were a more modest version of the St Kilda proprietary baths, with its orb-like domes built alongside in 1906. Notionally, men and women were still segregated in their separate baths at this time, but here the sexes mix freely on the diving board and in the water, either blissfully unaware of or openly defying the local rulings which would keep them apart. And in a competitive market, baths proprietors may have been inclined to turn a blind eye to changing bathing customs, rather than risk losing business through rigorous rule enforcement. Indeed, on issue after issue concerning beach customs, the public forced a shifting line in the sand. Sunday bathing, shrinking bathing costumes, not covering up, and walking in the street in beachwear all began as gentle acts of civil disobedience and ended as accepted social behaviour. St Kilda's fortunes have always been tied to the baths and the beach. After the cable tram arrived in 1888, day trippers from across Melbourne found it even easier to plan a visit to the beach. By the 1920s, St Kilda was well established as both Melbourne's favourite playground and a seasonally popular place for holidays. And it was perhaps the holiday makers who pushed the boundaries the most. This was a time when young, single adults began to holiday together, away from their families and the constraints of home and community. Not that families missed out. Then, as now, the beach was a place for fun and leisure, for all age groups. It was also the place at which to be seen, to be photographed, and increasingly to be filmed. Former Melbourne Swimming Club representative Alex Sauter was one of Victoria's first professional diving and swimming coaches. His success rate in teaching the State Theatre Ballet girls the finer points of the Australian crawl, however, can only be guessed at. While St Kilda remained Melbourne's favourite beach, it was gradually losing its resort status and becoming merely a suburb, as the expanding Metropolitan Railway network made other Bayside beaches more accessible to day trippers or holiday makers. Not that these beach localities were exactly a well-kept secret, being among the first Melbourne suburbs to be developed. The east was also the side of the bay favoured by prevailing winds and waves for sand deposit. As a result, sandy beaches on the east coast stretch virtually unbroken from Port Melbourne to the Heads. And as the motorcar became more popular and affordable, they were all within relatively easy reach. Each Bayside beach in this extended playground has its own character and its share of devotees gathered over the years. The bay beaches may have lacked the excitement of ocean surf, but many beachgoers, especially family groups, preferred the gentle waters and generally safe and clean stretch of shoreline along the east coast. For the most part, the roles of residential suburb and recreational facility merged happily, the sea rarely out of sight, houses and shops on one side and the beach on the other. Bay beach fashions may have varied from one year to the next, but certain customs and activities seemed to defy change. Including the Aussie Salute, an automatic beachgoer's response to the first fly of summer, the futility of ignoring the sun's rays, and the pleasures of sharing a family packet of sweets, or not. There were also various ways to get about on top of the water. Or not. And there were recreational opportunities offshore as well. Mordialloc conducted a 50-kilometre Grand Prix bike race as part of its involvement in the ongoing Melbourne Centenary Carnival activities in January 1935. St Kilda staged an annual soapbox derby, a well-patronised and always keenly contested affair. Frankston offered a specially funded model campsite for children from rural areas, which also gave most of them their first exposure to the seaside. But more often, individuals or groups would impart their own sense of occasion to Bay Beach visits. The images of this party from St Paul's Church of England in Canterbury on their Sunday school picnic to Edithvale in 1927 would be familiar to most people who visited any of the Bay beaches in a group situation. These same beaches would retain their charms, if not their crowds, during the winter months. With water temperatures dipping regularly below 10 degrees Celsius at this time of year, only the hardy souls would continue to take a dip in the briny. The best known of these are the icebergers, who have been performing their daily rituals at the Middle Brighton sea baths for more than 40 years. This gallant band of men and women has achieved almost cult status in Melbourne's Bayside area, and its special brand of madness has caught the attention of filmmakers and news camera crews alike. Prominent Australian film historian Ross Cooper spent some time with the icebergers, recording interviews and filming their routines in the winter of 1970. Icebergers' membership has since risen to around 130, of which about 70 diehards swim every day. While the water temperature is monitored each morning, the winter chill is absolutely no deterrent to the regulars. As one member put it, the hardest part is getting your feet on the bedroom floor in the morning. The rest is easy. The regular icebergers are from all walks of life and from all ages, with many over 50. All of them respond to the mateship and the invigorating exercise. In 1972, TV reporter Wayne Tregaskis also interviewed some of the intrepid swimmers for the Channel O news service.
How long have you been doing this?
Oh, about 8 years.
How do you feel for it?
Very good.
Would this morning be a reasonable morning or particularly a cold one?
I think this morning's pretty good, really. It's a bit fresh, but the water's very clear and mild this morning.
And in a moment of insanity, the young reporter was persuaded to give it a try for himself.
It's freezing!
Go on.
No! I can't! Stop! Can't. Oh. You said it wasn't cold. God.
In recent years, many of the icebergers have also competed in the annual Winter Swim Classic, previously the Winter Mile Championship, the event named in honour of long-serving president and heart and soul of the Icebergers Club, Harry Raisbeck. Now in his 90s, Harry still swims around a kilometre at Brighton each day and is a regular in the Swim Classic as well. Another less than conventional use of a bay baths facility was a safety drill undertaken by Australian National Airways at Brighton in March 1953. This procedure was to be used in the event of an air crash at sea and included life raft inflation and using a hand-powered transmitter with a box kite aerial to seek aid. The more capable swimmers would then swim out to the life raft and help the less able swimmers clamber aboard. Strong swimmers have also been effecting beach rescues around Port Phillip for as long as unwary bathers have gotten into difficulty in the water. From humble beginnings early last century has sprung a unique life-saving movement and an appealing variety of beach carnivals and competitions. The first life-saving clubs in Melbourne were established around 1910. Within a few years, many of the Northern Bay beaches had clubs affiliated with the Royal Life-Saving Society, their members pioneering the new service to the increasing number of swimmers using the sea. And during the summer months, the colourful flags, costumes and caps of competitors from local and interstate clubs soon became a regular feature of invitational carnivals and annual championships staged at St Kilda, Elwood and eventually other inner beaches as well. Unlike their counterparts in the surf life-saving movement, women were always well represented in the Melbourne-based clubs, which afforded newsreel commentators opportunities for even more patronising remarks than usual at the time.
Sydney is accustomed to such sights as this on sunny weekends, but where Melbourne has it over Sydney is there a breaker available? We want to be saved. Well, what do you think? It would be a pleasure to get out of your depth with charmers like this running to the rescue. Blue-eyed and beautiful. So next time we surf in Melbourne, here's hoping there's an undertow.
But as this 1932 carnival footage illustrates, in the gentler waters of Port Phillip Bay, women lifesavers were no less efficient in carrying out beach rescue techniques than their male counterparts. They also worked just as conscientiously on improving their marching skills. Mastering their land drills, and enjoying the camaraderie the club environment offered. But despite the spread of the volunteer life-saving movement over the years, not all bay beaches were regularly patrolled during summer. The Beaumaris Parents and Citizens Association showed its concern about any falling off in lifesaver numbers by commissioning Melbourne documentary filmmaker Ted Davis to film a club carnival at Watkins Bay in March 1958, and in doing so stressed the value of the service to prospective members. Then State President of the Royal Life-Saving Society, Murray Porter, reinforced the film's message.
On those beaches which our club members patrol, we have a record of safety which is unsurpassed. And I feel that a district such as Beaumaris, which is growing faster than any other district on the Bayside, which has a greater percentage of children than any other district, cannot afford, and I repeat, cannot afford, to be without a life-saving club.
Life-saving competitions also help club members refine rescue and resuscitation techniques, the basics of the voluntary lifesaver patrols of the bay and other beaches. The resuscitation drill being practiced by these lifesavers was known as the Schaefer method. It gained currency in the early 1900s and remained in use by Australian lifesavers for more than 40 years. The technique was featured in this cinema precursor of the community service announcement, a cautionary tale about the dangers of bathing too soon after a meal, commissioned in 1927 by the National Safety Council. The Schaefer system of reviving victims consisted of applying repeated pressure to the rib cage of their backs. The resuscitation sequence also featured a walk-on appearance by a member of the Melbourne Traffic Police, a co-sponsor of the film. Over the years, lifesavers also experimented with various purpose-designed equipment with a view to finding more efficient ways of saving lives on Melbourne's beaches.
Hello, control. This is Red.
At Seaford, for example, where there were several kilometres of beach to be patrolled, a walkie-talkie system was trialled.
Loud and clear. Have spotted your position. Respirator crew is waiting.
The young Seaford lifesavers also tried out the use of an iron lung stretcher, part of a portable respirator that could be towed behind a car and transported to any beach emergency. The stretcher was placed inside the mobile respirator and oxygen administered to the demonstration victim in the iron lung. This one was pumped by hand. Smiles all round after a successful trial, but the idea never really caught on. By the 1960s, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was universally accepted, as demonstrated in an Ampol-sponsored film from this period. Speed in reaching struggling swimmers was also paramount in the prevention of drowning. From the testing of a new engine-powered lifeboat featuring a completely caged propeller to prevent injury to swimmers in the 1950s, to the use of motorised rubber dinghies in the 1980s, the St Kilda Lifesaving Club, like its counterparts up and down the bay, was constantly upgrading its rescue systems in order to better protect the thousands of visitors to bay beaches each summer. Alongside the lifesaving clubs dotted on both sides of the bay are the yacht clubs, more than 20 of them in the northern portion alone. Yacht club activity on Port Phillip Bay dates back to the 1850s, and the bay has over the years developed a reputation as a world-class centre for sailing. In 1956, it was scheduled to host the Olympic Sailing Regatta, and Victorian yachtsmen trained vigorously in the gym at HMAS Lonsdale and out on the bay in the hope of being selected to represent their country. When the Olympic yachting program began, Royal St Kilda Yacht Club was used as the control centre for all events.
For some of these events, many of the countries competing brought their own boats. For others, competitors were required to use boats which they had not previously sailed. The events provided some of the finest yacht racing ever contested on Port Phillip Bay. White wings and a following wind. Who among us could fail to thrill to the sight of blue water and the sound of wind in the sails?
Port Phillip Bay also hosted the 1999 World Championships, one of the largest sailing regattas ever held, with more than 5,000 competitors and 200 yachts from more than 70 countries taking to the water. Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett was happy to talk up the suitability of Melbourne's backyard to stage a regatta 5 times larger than the Sydney Olympics sailing program.
I do see it as the starting point of greater utilisation of Port Phillip Bay for yachting events and yachting competition.
The 16 events were conducted under the auspices of 9 local yacht clubs around the coastline, from Blairgowrie to Geelong. For the first time, sailors also competed for the President of the International Olympic Committee's Cup, a competition designed to determine the best sailing nation in the world and duly claimed by the host country. The annual races to Devonport and Hobart also focus attention on the bay as a significant site for major sailing competition, with the Melbourne to Hobart event preceded by the traditional Cock of the Bay dash from Port Melbourne to Mornington. In the 1992 contest, triggered by the majestic Lady Nelson, the maxi yacht Walk on the Wild Side was forced to restart as the rest of the fleet made good time down the bay. Despite the mishap, Wildside still engaged in a spirited battle for line honours with eventual winner Vendetta and flying colours as the leading yachts neared Mornington. Most of the Northern Bay yacht clubs have long and distinguished histories, including the fondly remembered St Kilda 14-foot Sailing Club, regarded as one of the most famous small boat clubs in Australian yachting history. Originally formed as the St Kilda Sailing and Angling Club in 1905, it was based at Brooks Boat Shed in Marine Parade, and especially in the early years was prominent in sail and hull design and innovation. But despite being very active in sailing circles and highly competitive in Australian Championship events, the club always struggled for funds. And with Brooks Jetty covering a stormwater drain, the club's premises were often subject to damage during storm activity. With new classes and designs appearing in the 1950s and a downturn in membership, the 14-foot Sailing Club finally merged with Royal St Kilda Yacht Club in 1961. An equally colourful history is that of the Victorian Ladies Yacht Club, the only one of its kind in the world exclusively for women, with its own clubhouse and a membership which at its peak hit the 150 mark. The club was formed in August 1945 by a group of keen women sailors who'd found it impossible to join existing yacht clubs because of lack of facilities or to crew on boats in competitive sailing, which incurred automatic disqualification. Its founder and first Commodore was Alison Hall, wearing the white beanie in this group shot from 1946. The original clubhouse, on the east side of Sandringham Pier, was constructed by members from two ancient boats for hire sheds joined together. At that time, water came right up to the seawall in front of the boat sheds, and boats could be launched with a minimum of carrying. This newsreel clip shows initial club members confidently handling the cadet dinghy Pegasus. And the 28-foot sloop named Escapade. Sandringham was chosen because of its centrality for most members, and from these modest beginnings, the Ladies Yacht Club went from strength to strength. Membership fees and enthusiastic fundraising activities kept the club on a sound financial footing. A number of racing and training boats were purchased, and a new clubhouse adjoining the Sandringham Yacht Club was built and opened in 1966. From the annual Blessing of the Fleet ceremony in October, racing was conducted each weekend until around Easter. The club's program included novelty and treasure races and family events. Many of these events and preparations for them, as well as club working bees and activities during the winter months, were captured on film during the 1970s by long-serving member Jill McCann, including running repairs to the club flagship Moonraker, building a barbecue from bluestone pitchers obtained from Brighton Council, ongoing clubhouse maintenance, internal and external, tracking repairs and extension, and with state government assistance, the purchase, after a 29-year wait, of a crash boat. By the 1980s, a new era was at hand, with the departure of several key members and the introduction of the Equal Opportunities Act, raising the question of open membership. A change in the Constitution in 1982 conferred the VLYC's new status as a family club, with an official name change to the Hampton Sailing Club the following year. In retrospect, the Victorian Ladies Yacht Club had done more than gain recognition for women in the yachting world and secure admission to its clubs. For those who played a part in its development and success, it would always be remembered as a home where friendship and cooperative effort made all things possible. The Northern Bay area features notable landmarks along or adjacent to both coastlines. To the west, the city of Geelong retained many fine buildings from its colonial past. While the magnificent mansion at Werribee Park, built by the Chirnside family in 1877, has, since its purchase by the state government in 1972, gone on to become one of Victoria's major tourist attractions. The Chirnsides also became associated with the newly established Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works in 1892, when Werribee Farm was developed on adjacent land over the next 6 years. The Board of Works had been created expressly to implement the proposal, put forward by a visiting British engineer, for the construction of a deep sewerage system and treatment plant at Werribee, an overdue solution to the horrendous state of Melbourne's drains and the prevalence of disease at that time. By the 1920s, when this film was shot, the farm employed 160 people, with 65 homes scattered among the extensive plantations of gums and pines. Nearby is the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Point Cook, the first military airfield anywhere when established by the Australian government. The first flight there was made in 1914, within months of the outbreak of the Great War. Since that date, until 1992, Point Cook has been a flight training base, the oldest operating airfield of this kind in the world. In this newsreel segment from 1935, advanced student pilots are taking part in a day's air drill in formation flying and bombing practice over the bay. Senior Army and Air Force officers have also used the base as the departure point for familiarisation exercises. In this example from 1959, making their first parachute jump into Northern Bay waters. Altona, one of the few beach suburbs west of Melbourne, but better known post-war as a major centre for petrochemical industries. Williamstown on Hobson's Bay was established as Melbourne's first deep-water port in 1837 and is the oldest continuous settlement on the shores of Port Phillip. The picturesque suburb has retained something of its 19th century character and continues to draw visitors for that reason alone. The Merritt Rifle Range was established in 1870 and used by the armed forces to train recruits in target shooting and other manoeuvres. This film taken prior to their departure for active military service during the Great War. The Army was also involved at the rifle range during the Melbourne Olympics in 1956, coordinating all the shooting events. This is the running deer competition in progress. The Williamstown range was ultimately sold in 1987 by the Urban Land Authority. The often windswept oval at Point Gellibrand is another familiar Williamstown site. the city celebrated the opening of its new £12,000 grandstand, named after local parliamentarian W.L. Floyd, by staging a gala athletic meeting. This is a heat of the 75 yards Victorian Women's Championship sprint. But it's Williamstown's maritime heritage and atmosphere which continues to define the area. Gem Pier, here mooring pilot and customs launches, is the direct successor of Melbourne's first pier. Reed Street Pier, home to a range of commercial tugs. While at the Ports and Harbours Depot at Ann Street, the restoration of a 40-foot wooden launch proceeds alongside work on the wooden tug Victory. But arguably the most prominent Williamstown site is the dockyard facility at Point Gellibrand, with its distinguished record of berthing, repairing, building and launching ships for well over 120 years. Gellibrand Pier traditionally had also been the hive of activity for commercial shipping, in this instance loading bags of wheat for export. Also at Point Gellibrand is the old bluestone time ball tower, erected in 1849 to synchronise ships' chronometers and restored subsequent to this film record to highlight its original function. Nearby is Fort Gellibrand, built in 1855 as part of the state's defence against the threat of Russian invasion during the Crimean War. The slightly more mobile defence fortress from the same era, HMVS Cerberus, would also anchor at Williamstown when not on patrol. The pride of the Victorian Navy in the 1870s, and for a period the most heavily armed vessel south of the equator, was eventually requisitioned by the Commonwealth and moved to Geelong in 1921 to act as a storage ship. In 1926, the hull, complete with turrets and guns, was bought by Sandringham Council and towed across to Black Rock to be scuttled and used as a breakwater, a function it's performed since that time. But not always without incident. The decks of the Cerberus, usually several metres above water, listed heavily seaward in December 1993 after a battering from high seas and torrential downpours. Amid genuine community concerns about the historic vessel's survival, local activist and historian Graham Disney was hopeful that the Cerberus could be towed to the Yarra to become part of a maritime exhibition near the Polly Woodside.
If that can't be done, well then we'd like to try and at least support her where she stands and stop her from collapsing entirely into the sea. If she's too far gone for that, then I guess the fallback plan would be to remove the turrets and any other valuable pieces before she finally goes.
The Cerberus is the best preserved ironclad monitor, a type of warship left in the world. The only other example is lying at the bottom of the sea off the Californian coast. The Save the Cerberus Committee is hoping for support from the private sector for the salvage project, as well as the state and federal governments.
But any plans to refloat her were dashed several months later after an underwater examination revealed the extent of the storm damage. The buoyant hull supporting the wreck had corroded and collapsed quite beyond repair. Without government support, the hulk of the old warship has continued its silent vigil 200 metres offshore at Half Moon Bay, its future uncertain. The eastern coastline was also notable for a series of substantial hotels, reflecting the boom times in which they were built. Of these, Sandringham House, originally constructed as a coffee palace in 1889, was for many years the most prominent building in the district. When the premises were licensed in the 1930s, the building was modernised but still retained much of its original grandeur. Sadly, only the foundation stone survived the demolisher's hammer in 1967, a small reminder of a more genteel age. Other Bayside landmarks managed to survive the march of progress. The familiar statue of ex-Victorian Premier and perennial Brighton MP Sir Thomas Bent suffered nothing worse than temporary suspension and relocation during road widening works at the intersection of Nepean Highway and Bay Street in 1980. As the newly elected MLA for Brighton, Tommy Bent had also purchased a triangle of land bounded by Hampton, Halifax and Dendy Streets in 1872. Later subdivided and sold, the site soon boasted a handsome 13-roomed colonial residence, subsequently resold, remodelled and named Billilla. The Brighton City Council acquired the property for public purposes in April 1973. Brighton's development had been assisted by extensions to the rail line in the late 1850s. The municipality achieved town status in 1887 and received a further boost in 1906 with the construction of an electric tram line, providing another direct link with the business district of Melbourne. The City of Brighton celebrated its centenary in 1959. Aside from its impressive Victorian and Edwardian residences, Brighton's Bayside landmarks included its sea baths at Middle Brighton and Brighton Beach. The first enclosure at Middle Brighton was erected in 1881 and, variously renovated, remains the only surviving sea baths enclosure in Port Phillip Bay. The Brighton Beach baths predated Middle Brighton by some 18 years and remained hugely popular well into the 20th century. Eventually, attendances began to decline, with the sea baths falling out of repair and unable to compete with inland pools. Even so, the decision to demolish the Brighton Beach baths in early 1979 was not made without fierce local opposition and debate. More fortunate was the last great stand of bathing boxes, which continued to dominate Dendy Street Beach. The little wooden huts had progressively been banished from other beaches, but the group of 83 colourful boxes at Brighton continued to enjoy public favour, council support and custodianship by the Brighton Bathing Box Association. Commercial streetscapes in the eastern Bayside areas have evolved according to the success or otherwise of the businesses which occupied them. This is a glimpse of how the Glenhuntly and Ormond Road intersection at Elwood looked in the 1930s. But by far the most frequently filmed precinct at the top end of the bay is St Kilda. The one-time playground of the wealthy, St Kilda has become a bay icon, a mixture of architecture and a unique melting pot of cultures, fashion and peoples. Its much-loved football team was a foundation member of the then Victorian Football League. Its surviving 19th century hotels landmarks in their own right. As is the hub of much social activity in St Kilda, the Pier, erected around the turn of last century and rebuilt with concrete in 1970. The pavilion remains much as it looked when it was originally built. The municipal baths, in contrast, had undergone numerous changes over the same period. The St Kilda proprietary baths were destroyed by fire and eventually replaced by the new St Kilda City Baths in 1931. Inspired by a Moorish motif, they were hailed as the most modern in Australia. But they never returned a profit, and by the 1970s and 80s, After providing tenure for the South Pacific Health Club and later a series of discos and nightclubs, the baths had languished, along with their reputation. The old baths were finally demolished in 1995, and only after a protracted struggle involving local council, developers and resident action groups as to what new bathing complex should occupy the historic site did any sort of acceptable compromise emerge. St Kilda's pleasure resort status owed much to the work of a foreshore committee created in 1906. Under its direction, Carlo Catani remodelled parts of the foreshore to resemble a European resort with a split-level esplanade, dance halls, theatres and amusements. The popularity of seasonal amusements and beachfront vaudeville entertainments provided by such groups as the English Pierrots suggested that the St Kilda foreshore would be a lucrative source of council revenue if sites were rented to showmen. And so it proved. By the 1920s, the entrepreneurial Phillips brothers from Seattle had re-erected their successful Palais de Danse on a key site in this precinct to make room next door for their new Palais Cinema. The ballroom continued to do well in its new location, despite the protests of churchmen and councillors about the temptations of the tango and corruption of public morals. The revamped Palais Picture Theatre was also lost to fire in 1926. But in its stead rose a new theatre of the grandest scale, able to seat 3,000 people and still operating 3/4 of a century later, one of Melbourne's few surviving examples of the Great Picture Palace era. In its heyday, the Palais was much more than a cinema. It was a showplace of Melbourne's finest performers. Entertainment was provided by the Palais' own orchestra, led by resident musical director Harry Jacobs, who had also filmed his hand-picked musicians hamming it up for his camera. On the upper esplanade, another popular dance venue was the Wattle Path Palais de Danse, which opened in 1923 and attracted more than its share of well-heeled patrons. But by the late 1930s, the dance halls were struggling. Their cycle appeared to be over. And Harry Kleiner, who managed the Wattle Path venue, took a punt in having it converted into a skating rink, a starry palace of ice called St Moritz. Harry Jacobs' daughter, Wendy Lee, was employed by Kleiner to produce ice shows there in the following years. Kleiner's gamble seemed worthwhile. Melbourne had only one other skating rink at the time, the Glaciarium, and after refitting, St Moritz could accommodate more than 2,000 people and had more than 20,000 square feet of ice made by a refrigeration plant with 4 huge compressors. The Wattle Path venue had earlier been fitted out, for a brief period only, as a film studio in December 1933 by flamboyant entrepreneur F.W.
Ladies and gentlemen.
In the event, Thring completed only one full feature at Wattle Path.
To produce talking pictures in Australia.
Although the studio was also hired by director Charles Chauvel to film the interior scenes of his ambitious feature, Heritage.
And the cameramen are watching their cameras. And they're just as worried about their job as you are about yours. There's only one thing, dear, that I want you to remember. And that is that only you and the performer that you're acting with counts. Peggy, this time I want tears. And I don't want to resort to any of the old tricks to get them. I want real tears.
If St Kilda didn't quite deliver on its promise to become an Antipodean Hollywood, it has over the years maintained solid links with the arts and filmmaking fraternity. The St Kilda Film Festival, from modest beginnings in 1984, has gone from strength to strength and become an important date on the annual Melbourne Film Events calendar. The first of several filmed versions of the story of the Kelly Gang had also been partly shot in St Kilda at the rear of the chemical works of Millard Johnson and William Gibson. And among the early 20th century amusements along the foreshore, St Kilda boasted an open-air cinema, one of the first permanent screening venues to cater for the growing public fascination with motion pictures. But the whole foreshore entertainment enterprise really came of age with the opening of Luna Park, the newest, greatest and best amusement park in the world, on Friday the 13th of December 1912. Earlier amusement ventures on this site had failed, but this was something else altogether. Tucked between two lofty Moorish towers, and under a huge electric sign sat Mr. Moon, toothy mouth agape to allow the fun seekers to enter. Canadian entrepreneur J.D. Williams, who had film interests in Australia as well as part ownership of Luna Park itself, filmed the opening, or rather the pre-opening, since Williams had no facility to film successfully at night at this time. He could, however, show some of the original park attractions in action. The American Bowl Slide, only the third of its kind in the world. The giant Ferris wheel, a steal at threepence per ride. Some of the opening night performers were also shown in rehearsal. Louina and Franz perfecting their thrilling daredevil act called Slide for Life. In the background is the Palais de Folie, the precursor of the Giggle Palace. Herr Granado and Mademoiselle Fedora on the high wire, practicing their wire-walking elephant routine, minus costume, and with costume. But the jewel in Luna Park's crown was the Scenic Railway, the first roller coaster built in the Southern Hemisphere. The exhilarating ride passed through the tops of the entrance towers and over the top of Mr. Moon's face, then dipped and curved around the park's triangular boundary. The ride experience was first captured some years later by what might now be called roller coaster cam. Luna Park was closed for most of the First World War, except for some patriotic carnivals. The Palais de Folie was called Maryland during this period. A lease dispute then kept the park closed until October 1923. The reopening saw the refurbishment of existing attractions and the addition of a number of new ones, including a £15,000 carousel acquired from Sydney's White City and adorned with 6,000 lights. A water chute. Noah's Ark. And the Big Dipper, designed by American John A. Miller, known as the master roller coaster designer from the Philadelphia Toboggan Company, which had also supplied the impressive carousel. The opening was preceded by a massive ad campaign, partly aimed at children who were admitted free to Saturday matinees. Only the scenic railway and river caves remained much the same as before the war. The continued success of Luna Park depended upon the novelty and public acceptance of new attractions each season, such as the Ghost Train and the Rotor, installed in 1951. The tradition of featuring performing artists and novelty acts to generate interest and publicity was also continued over the years. One of the park opening stunts, for example, was reprised in January 1936 when patrons witnessed another slide for life in which the aerialist hanging by his teeth slid down a wire from the top of the Jack and Jill ride to the Dodgem Pavilion. Less spectacular, but certainly more bizarre, was the Girl in the Ice Coffin novelty act, in which the performer demonstrates how to beat a Melbourne summer heatwave by spending 20 minutes totally encased in hollowed-out blocks of ice. While the Flying Ashtons, Merv and Doug, needed little introduction to Melbourne audiences in the 1960s, their blindfolded trapeze act, performed at night for the newsreel camera with the illuminated river cave's exterior as background, was equally good publicity for Ashton Circus and the Luna Park Company.
He's done it! It takes nerves of steel, but that's just what the Flying Ashtons have got.
For many years, Luna Park had such drawing power that other amusement operators clustered at a busy fun fair nearby, on a triangle of land known as Little Luna Park, leasing sites from the Foreshore Committee. In this bustling corner, the merry-go-round had pride of place. Designed and constructed by Herbert Thompson, the designer of Australia's first steam car, the much-loved carousel was transported to Canberra in the 1970s and still operates in the Civic Mall. The fun fair also had its own Ferris wheel, predating Luna Park's, and variations on the aeroplane ride, including the Wizzy Whirl, the circular chaeroplane spin, which was still busily enticing youngsters for the princely sum of threepence in the 1940s. But if Luna Park itself continued to dominate St Kilda foreshore entertainment, by the late 1950s its fortunes were in slow decline. With the downturn in business, the park's future looked increasingly grim, especially after demolition of the Big Dipper in 1989. But following the introduction of heritage controls, after persistent lobbying by the Friends of Luna Park group,
we're really concerned that the redevelopment is imaginative and that it recreates Luna Park's essential character, which is of a fantasy landscape.
And the purchase of a 50-year lease of Luna Park by the BCR Group in 1998, its status as a Melbourne icon seemed assured. Importantly, an extensive restoration program has guaranteed new life for the majestic carousel, the entrance face and towers, and the scenic railway, which is now the only still functional roller coaster from the early 20th century and the only surviving example of brakeman-operated carriages in the world. Melbourne's eastern Bayside strip effectively begins at Port Melbourne, with pleasant beaches located on both sides of the port facilities. The area itself developed as a mix of industry and housing, tucked in between the bay and the Yarra River. Some of the earliest surviving film in Australia was also shot in the Port Melbourne area. Its railway station featured as the exit point for the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York's Melbourne visit on the 16th of May 1901. The railway line from the city to Port Melbourne opened in 1854 and was the first steam-operated train line in Australasia. In March 1905, employees at Swallow and Ariel's biscuit factory in Rouse Street were recorded leaving work at the end of the day, an inducement for them to attend screenings of the completed film at Protestant Alliance Friendly Society meetings at the Port Melbourne Town Hall. Both Port Melbourne and South Melbourne beaches were serviced by cable trams. The South Melbourne line terminated in Victoria Avenue. A short distance west, the Port Melbourne line concluded. The Port Melbourne railway station stood adjacent to the bridge beyond the cable tram terminus. As one of the older inner city areas, the character of Port Melbourne was firmly working class. Local residents tended to work either on the wharves or in the various factories, many of which became readily identifiable landmarks over the years. Its major access routes and shopping centre were equally familiar to locals and visitors alike. Port residents, for the most part, occupied narrow attached cottages with small yards. These were supplemented by the first initiative of the newly created Housing Commission, the draining of the Fisherman's Bend area in the early 1940s to erect one of Australia's first public housing estates, Garden City. But these homes were still out of reach for most of Port's industrial or wharf workers, so the Commission extended Garden City to a more affordable style of dwelling. However, it is the two lengthy Port Melbourne piers jutting out into Port Phillip Bay which are probably the most important sites in Port's social, industrial and maritime histories. Station Pier in particular has been a mecca for ship lovers as the maritime world made its way to Melbourne's doorstep. The view of an arriving or departing vessel has never failed to stir the blood. Over the past century, many maritime craft, either visiting Melbourne or being built and launched here, have been captured on film by the professional cinematographer or the enthusiastic amateur. Famous liners, warships bristling with the latest technology, the last conventional cargo ships. The northern end of Port Phillip Bay afforded opportunities galore to witness the passing parade of maritime history. As part of the oldest surviving complete documentary on Melbourne, Cousin Spencer's cinematographer Ernest Higgins filmed, from left to right of picture, the British P-class cruiser Prometheus and the Dutch battleships De Ruyter, Hertog Hendrik and Koningen Regentis. They are alongside Town Pier at Port Melbourne, where they arrived on the 30th of September 1910 from Sydney. Just over 2 months later, on the 10th of December, a Pathé newsreel cameraman recorded the welcome given to the torpedo boat destroyers Parramatta and Yarra on their arrival at Alfred Graving Dock at the Williamstown Naval Depot. These were the first 2 of 6 river-class torpedo boats, significant additions to what was then known as the Commonwealth Naval Forces, renamed the Royal Australian Navy in 1911. The newsreel also caught the earlier arrival at the Naval Depot of the Governor-General and the State Governor for this event, having travelled from Port Melbourne Town Pier aboard the naval picket boats. A sobering note on this auspicious occasion was the death of Engineer Lieutenant W.J. Robertson, who had fallen from HMAS Yarra and sustained fatal head injuries almost within sight of home. Pathé also recorded his funeral procession through the streets of Melbourne 2 days later. The Navy's only battle cruiser, the first RAN ship to bear the name HMAS Australia, was commissioned in 1913. This film was taken in Melbourne as part of the coverage of Admiral Jellicoe's visit and shows Australia's departure from New Pier at Port Melbourne on the 13th of June 1919. This was her first call at Port Melbourne since returning from service with the Grand Fleet, which may explain the remarkably informal atmosphere on board. HMAS Australia was also filmed as part of the Royal Fleet Review, which took place on Port Phillip Bay on the 28th of May 1920, the first to be held outside British waters. Dense fog made aerial filming difficult as the flotilla steamed towards Melbourne, although Louis Mountbatten was reported as saying it was as well the fog had set in, so locals couldn't see how small the fleet was. Principal interest centred on the arrival of the 38,000-tonne British Greyhound battle cruiser HMS Renown at New Pier, now renamed Princess Pier, following the arrival of the Prince of Wales. The Australian naval patrol boat Franklin served as the royal yacht for the Prince's visit. Also in attendance were the pilot ship Alvina and the paddle steamer Hygeia, all filmed from the deck of the Australia. Behind Hygeia in this shot is HMAS Una, the former German yacht Comet, which would become the pilot ship Akuna in 1925. The Flower-class sloop seen in the background here was part of a post-war gift from the Royal Navy. The Renown was back in Port Phillip Bay as part of the royal visit by the Duke and Duchess of York in April 1927. The people of Melbourne also had the opportunity 3 years earlier to see the biggest warship in the world, the celebrated HMS Hood, accompanied by the battle cruiser Repulse and the light cruisers Danae, Dauntless, Delhi, Dragon and Dunedin. 35,000 people had visited the ships in one day while they were berthed at Port Melbourne late in March 1924. The following year, it was the Americans' turn. The large flotilla of battleships and destroyers, including the four-funnelled armoured cruiser USS Seattle, arrived in Port Phillip Bay in July 1925. This is the light cruiser Marblehead, properly referred to as a scout cruiser by the Americans at this time. Carrying a seaplane on board would have helped in this role. The Seattle carried the four-star Admiral S. Robertson, newly elevated to Fleet Command at this time. The US sailors were obviously looking forward to their shore leave after several months at sea, and to meeting the locals as well. Sailors aboard HMAS Canberra were equally pleased to be in Melbourne when the latest addition to the Australian fleet made its first visit to the southern capital in February 1929. They also had the chance to show off the warship's firepower on public visiting day at Port Melbourne. The Canberra was back in November 1929. Its visit scheduled to coincide with the running of the Melbourne Cup. The Canberra was joined at Port Melbourne by sister ship and flagship, the new HMAS Australia, giving the Australian squadron a pair of county-class heavy cruisers. Naval visitors in the 1930s included the fleet training ship Colm, the first visit by a German warship in 20 years. The Colm carried 70 naval cadets and arrived in Melbourne in April 1933 as part of a goodwill and training cruise around the world. One of the most impressive flotillas assembled in Bay waters during this period consisted of the heavy cruisers Sussex, Canberra and Australia, 3 destroyers, 2 light cruisers, and the sloop Hindustan. HMS Sussex was headed for Melbourne in October 1934 with the Duke of Gloucester aboard for the city's centenary celebrations. The second of 3 sister cruisers obtained for fleet modernisation, HMAS Hobart made her first visit to Melbourne in December 1938. She had been built as HMS Apollo and commissioned in the Royal Navy in 1936 before her purchase by the Australian Navy. By the 1940s, our own ship construction program was underway at Williamstown.
Welcome addition to Australia's wartime shipping is this 9,000 tons all-Australian merchantman, the River Loddon. Largest vessel to be launched from Victorian dockyards, she came through exhaustive tests with colours flying. Experts came aboard to watch the trials, and on the bridge with the master, Captain Barrington, is Captain E. Mackay, RAN, General Manager of the Williamstown dockyards. But now the tug's away. The River Loddon is an oil burner, but she can be converted for coal if necessary. In 11 hours cruising, she ran the measured mile 10 times. Fit and polish is the order of the day. Even the ship's bell takes on a coat of glamour. At the order action stations, the River Loddon bears her teeth. Even her armament is Australian-made.
Subsequent launchings at the Williamstown Naval Dockyards were also filmed, including the battle-class destroyer HMAS Anzac in August 1948, and the sleek River-class anti-submarine frigate HMAS Yarra, the 3rd Australian man-of-war to bear this name, in September 1958. The name was selected to carry on that of the sloop sunk by Japanese cruisers in 1942. 5 of the 13 survivors were present at this launching. Other naval highlights in the 50s included the arrival of the RAN's second aircraft carrier, HMAS Melbourne, first seen at Port Melbourne in May 1956. On deck, a squadron of Sea Venom jets and 2 squadrons of turboprop Fairy Gannet submarine chasers.
And it's time for shore leave for the ratings too. Home again after months away. Look out, sailor. They'll slap sales tax on that car. Banners and babies to attract the attention of the crew. Attract attention? Brother, you've said it.
The Melbourne was also filmed while participating in a naval exercise in the bay in November 1958.
Anti-submarine frigate Queenborough stands by as the Navy's planes pepper the target with rockets. Army and Air Force Staff College cadets are on board the carrier, and they're transferred to Queenborough in Navy style. Only a line between them and Port Phillip Bay, but they all make the crossing safely. And then the day's exercises are over. The Sea Venoms come into land, making perfect touchdowns at 110 knots.
Whenever the Melbourne, or any other naval vessel over the years, berthed alongside one of the Northern Bay piers, it was safe to assume that someone with a movie camera would record the visit. One vessel which came to stay was HMAS Castlemaine. She made her last sea voyage under tow by SS Rip from Western Port to the Yarra on the 26th of June 1974. The government made a gift of her to the Maritime Trust in September 1973. After subsequent transfer to Gem Pier at Williamstown, the Castlemaine underwent restoration and now remains in Hobson's Bay as a museum ship and permanent local tourist attraction. Bay watchers have also witnessed the wide variety of passenger shipping making its way to and from Melbourne, from humble migrant ships to some of the finest liners of the modern era. Again, many of these visits have been recorded on film, particularly during the 1960s, when the use of Melbourne's overseas passenger terminal was at its peak. Oronsay was one of 5 new liners the Orient Line had built in the 1920s for the Australian trade, 3 of which became casualties of war when operating as troop ships in the early 1940s. The other 2 sister ships, Otranto and Orontes, survived, and after refitting were returned to the passenger service. Otranto was withdrawn from service in 1957, having completed 64 round trips to Australia in peacetime. Orontes continued to serve a further 4 years, her final voyage to Australia beginning in November 1961. The first P&O liners to exceed 20,000 tonnes, RMS Multan and the Maloya, were also launched in the 1920s, and both completed 80 round trips in peacetime to Australia before completing their final voyages in the 1950s. This departure for England from Port Melbourne by the Maloya was filmed in February 1930 by keen amateur cinematographer Dr. A.J. Trinker. The similar-sounding Matson Line vessel, Mololo, was the first American liner to make an appearance in Melbourne as part of 2 lengthy cruises during 1930-31. This ship went on to become the Queen Frederica in 1954 and made several local visits after that date. The first of P&O's famous Strath liners, Strathneva, made her initial appearance in Melbourne in the early 1930s. The second, Strath Aird, soon after. This pair was built with 3 funnels, after war service returning to the Australian trade as 1-class liners with only a single funnel, but retaining the characteristic P&O colour scheme, white hull and yellow funnel. Orion was a firm favourite with travellers to and from Melbourne, making her maiden voyage in 1935 and remaining in service until 1963. Her appearance was so different from previous Orient Line vessels, and she was also given a new colour scheme, introducing the corn hull and buff funnel. But the biggest ship, the biggest anything to visit Melbourne in the 1930s, was the giant Canadian Pacific liner Empress of Britain, which spent a day berthed at Station Pier on the 6th of April 1938. None of the other transatlantic Leviathans constructed in the 1920s and 30s had ever ventured this far south, nor would they. That day in 1938 would be the port's only exposure to that genre of the luxury liner, and Melburnians turned out in force on the pier and on the water to grab their only opportunity to see an example of such a vessel. In March the following year, though, another giant entered the bay for the first time.
Here she comes, sailing up Port Phillip, the biggest ship in the Australian trade, the biggest motor vessel afloat, the Dominion Monarch on her maiden voyage. 30 days from Southampton to Melbourne, a speed achieved by motors producing 32,000 horsepower, ultra-modern navigation, in charge of Captain Hartman. Appropriate for the Australian trade, a sports deck as big as any on the world's great liners, 18,000 square feet of floating playground, and there's a swimming pool. A luxury liner of 27,000 tons. Quite a motorboat.
The first brand new liner to arrive in Australia after the Second World War was Orchides, built for the Orient Line to replace their ship of the same name sunk during the war. Orchides arrived in Melbourne on her maiden voyage in January 1949. She was a frequent visitor thereafter, spending 2 weeks berthed in Melbourne during November 1956, serving as a floating hotel during the Olympic Games. Himalaya was rival P&O's first new passenger ship to begin regular voyages to Australia after World War II. She was launched at the same time as Orchides and had an identical hull, but her superstructure differed, and she was considered a more attractive ship. Himalaya became one of the most popular liners in the post-war era, her final voyage here occurring in 1974. Equally popular during this period was Arcadia, destined to be the last of the traditional design P&O liners to operate out of Australia, and Shaw Savile's Southern Cross, first seen in Melbourne in 1955. Lloyd Triestino's Australia was another familiar sight in the 1950s, stopping in Melbourne as part of the Italy-Australia run. The Matson line was also responsible for bringing large liners to Melbourne after the war via the Trans-Pacific route, including Mariposa, which arrived at Station Pier on her maiden voyage in November 1956. While the first appearance of the Chandris Line's Patrice in Port Phillip was made in January 1960. And when Britain's P&O and Orient lines merged in 1960, each shipping company was ready to introduce the largest, fastest and most luxurious liner ever built for a service other than the North Atlantic. Orient Line contributed the 42,000-ton Oriana, which first arrived in Melbourne in December 1960 on the last part of her maiden voyage. Filming the Oriana at Station Pier was Bob Mitchell, whose daughter Lynn and her friend Faye Evans were two of the 1,750 passengers on board for the return to Southampton on the 3rd of March 1961. The new liner, at this stage still displaying the distinctive corn and white Orient Line colours, had been prevented from sailing a day earlier by gale-force winds and huge seas. P&O's new flagship was the revolutionary designed Canberra, half a knot slower than the Oriana, but indisputably the biggest passenger ship ever to offer regular sailings to and from Melbourne, beginning in June 1961.
The 45,000-ton superliner Canberra reached Melbourne on her maiden voyage. The engines which power the 820-foot liner are mounted towards the stern to give maximum efficiency and passenger comfort at high speed. Big crowds gathered to watch her sail for Sydney. The Canberra was laid down in 1957 and has cost nearly £19 million, the largest passenger liner built in Britain since the end of World War II. Canberra can carry up to 2,288 passengers, and all in air-conditioned luxury. This is Pop In, a rumpus room for teenagers, and Jive has definitely replaced the sailor's hornpipe. There are bars and lounges too, and special play areas for kiddies.
But this romantic form of travel and the bustle of activity at Melbourne's overseas passenger terminal in the 1960s was, for various reasons, to come to an abrupt halt shortly after. It spelt doom for many of the great liners, but others, including Oriana and Canberra, continued in active service for years when converted into full-time cruise ships. The downturn in liner voyages also turned Station Pier into a virtual ghost pier, although the state government has worked hard in recent years to entice more cruise vessels to Melbourne. By far the largest and most famous of present-day ships to have visited in this capacity is Queen Elizabeth II, flagship of the Cunard Line. Since her maiden voyage in 1969, QE2 has had numerous refits, including a change of funnel, and travelled more than 4.5 million nautical miles. For those who can afford to travel on her, the massive liner is a luxuriously appointed and serviced floating city. For those greeting her arrival in Melbourne, the QE2 is a fond reminder of a bygone age, when multiple berthing of passenger ships at Station Pier was a regular occurrence. For Port Melbourne residents in recent years, a more familiar sight has been this vessel, filmed prior to its makeover as the Spirit of Tasmania and continuing the long tradition of passenger ferries crossing Bass Strait. Its predecessors recorded on film include Lungana, one of the first turbine-powered steamships in Australia. With a speed exceeding 20 knots and accommodation for 380 passengers, Loongana made her first crossing in 1904 and continued the Bass Strait trade for 30 years. Nerana was the first twin-screw vessel to run regularly across the strait, beginning service in 1921 and running until 1948 before being laid up and anchored at Port Melbourne. Taruna was another well-appointed vessel specially designed to cross Bass Strait, replacing Loongana in March 1935. Among her early passengers was young Ruth Richardson, accompanied by her family and Toy Rabbit. Their departure from North Wharf was recorded by Ruth's father Frank, later Sir Frank Richardson, in 1936. Taruna was requisitioned by the Commonwealth Government during the war years, returning to normal duties in 1946 after a refit and the removal of her second funnel. As well as cabin accommodation for over 400 passengers, Taruna provided garage space for 30 cars, but these had to be lifted on and off by crane. After the withdrawal of Nerana from service in 1948, Taruna continued the Bass Strait run on her own until 1959. Her replacement was the Princess of Tasmania, the first drive-on, drive-off ferry in the Southern Hemisphere commissioned by the Australian National Line. The crossing aboard POT, as she was called, took 14 hours overnight, with 3 return trips per week. She could carry 334 passengers, with a mixture of cabin facilities and reclining chairs in special lounges. Garage space was provided for 142 cars, with access through a stern door. Other innovations on the vessel included a bow propeller to assist in docking at the new terminal, which was constructed at what is now Webb Dock to accommodate the service. And the first vehicle to roll off after docking, the familiar red van carrying the Royal Mail. 10 years later, POT was joined in the Bass Strait trade by the larger Australian trader, which gave travellers to and from the mainland the best service they had ever known, for a short period at least. The Australian trader made her last voyage to Melbourne in April 1972, and was later sold to the Department of Defence, serving with the Navy as HMAS Jervis Bay until 1997. The ageing Princess was eventually withdrawn from service in June 1972 and replaced by Empress of Australia, which had been running between Sydney and Tasmania since 1965. The Empress was the largest passenger vessel ever built in Australia, but extensively modified for the shorter voyage. By the 1980s, she was the only passenger ship on the Australian coast. But she was not cost efficient, and the Tasmanian tourist industry sought a bigger and better ferry for the Bass Strait crossing, eventually settling on the $35 million luxury vessel Able Tasman, to be run by Tasmania's own shipping line, Transport Tasmania. She made her first crossing at the end of June 1985.
The sun was just coming up over Melbourne this morning when the Able Tasman glided calmly into our waters. The 19,000-tonne ship has double the capacity of other Bass Strait services, carrying 850 passengers and 440 vehicles. However, the crossing still takes 14 hours. The Able Tasman is named after the Dutch explorer who discovered Tasmania in 1642. The ship operated for 9 years in West Germany, and although there were industrial problems bringing it to Australia, they were quickly forgotten with today's rousing welcome.
The Able Tasman did the Melbourne to Devonport run for 10 years, but by the time of her 2000th crossing in November 1991, plans for her replacement were already well advanced. Transport Tasmania's floating hotel, Spirit of Tasmania, taking the interstate ferry service to an even greater level of sophistication and comfort. The The Spirit was originally the German TT Line vessel Peter Pan. These promotional pictures were taken in Europe before the changeover. She began operations for Transport Tasmania in November 1993, making 3 return crossings per week and over 300 each year. More recently, interstate sea travellers have also enjoyed a faster, if less opulent alternative to the Spirit, the Devil Cat, a wave-piercing catamaran ferry which operates during the summer peak. Devil Cat succeeds earlier catamaran-style ferries and is the largest and fastest of its type in the world, more than double the size of the original Sea Cat Tasmania. Devil Cat completed her maiden Bass Strait crossing in December 1998, a 6-hour journey compared to more than 14 for the Spirit. The ferry offers aircraft-style seating and uses motion sensors and stabilisers to smooth the heavy seas of Bass Strait. The Port of Melbourne has, of course, also handled its share of passenger ships for other interstate destinations over the years. And countless cargo vessels destined for or having arrived from interstate or foreign ports. This passing parade of commercial shipping has included such vessels as Bass Trader, the world's longest vehicle ferry service when it commenced operations in 1961. And the then biggest ship to enter the bay, the 97,000-tonne tanker Mobile Brilliant, which berthed in Melbourne in May 1964 to unload its huge cargo at the local refinery. Melbourne's tugboats, from the distinctive 2 funnels of the James Patterson to the more conventional lines of the Batman, have long been an integral part of the bay shipping scene as well. But even the best of them have a use-by date.
The tug Kira, last of Melbourne's coal burners. She's 40 years old and she tends to belch a bit too much black smoke to make her popular in a modern port. She doesn't manoeuvre the big liners anymore. Kira's recent life has been doing more menial chores, managing barges and small cargo ships. And soon, all that will be over too, because Kira is earmarked for retirement. Kira's replacement arrives from Adelaide, the Taronga. She's Melbourne's 6th tug capable of deep-sea towing operations, and she can stay at sea for 35 days. Taronga has a speed of 12.5 knots. She's the strongest tug working in this part of Australia. The 308-ton tug was built at Birkenhead, South Australia, by the Adelaide Ship Construction Company. She has all the latest technical aids for navigation and first-class cabin accommodation for her crew of 14. So the old Kira can tie up in peace. Another old tug who's puffed away. And she can be proud of her replacement, the sturdy, sleek Taronga, the toughest, strongest tug in Victorian waters.
But when other fondly remembered bay vessels reached their use-by date, there was nothing to replace them. After the demise of the grand old paddle steamers, it seemed that Melbourne turned its back on bay travel. Attempts to reopen the whole Bay Area to commuter and tourist ferry services in the 1980s all failed. The high-tech Spirit of Victoria, a $1 million luxury hydrofoil with huge wave-piercing pontoons. The Courier, Australia's first commercial hovercraft, with a cruising speed of 35 knots and capacity for 85 passengers. And the South Stein, impeccably restored as a floating convention centre, which languished for 2 years at Melbourne's dockside as another multi-million-dollar nail in the coffin of the failed Victorian Economic Development Corporation. Melbourne had had Sydney Harbour ferries on its waters before, including the North Head in the 1960s, and the Lady Chelmsford, rebuilt as a cruise ferry and taking up showboat duties here in the mid-80s. But this one had seemed to signal a new era in bay travel.
The South Stane is one of the largest of the few surviving steam passenger vessels in the world. It was built in 1938 and for almost half a century was a well-known site on Sydney Harbour. The failed Australian Vintage Travel Company bought the old ship and refurbished it for $8.5 million through the VEDC, and in 1988 it was used for a bicentennial reception for the Queen. Since the company went into receivership, the Melbourne-based Bay Steamers Limited has been trying to raise the $2 million to buy the vessel and keep it here. But now it's understood the receivers have reached agreement with a Newcastle buyer to sell for just $1 million.
A happier result was achieved with the steam tug Wattle. Built by the apprentices of Cockatoo Island Dockyard in Sydney during the Great Depression and completed in 1933, Wattle was purchased by the Navy for use as a yard tug at its Garden Island dockyard. The tug arrived in Melbourne in 1979 after being acquired by a local preservation group. Lovingly overhauled and restored by volunteer enthusiasts, she began carrying tourists around the port and bays in the early 1980s. With her oil-fired boiler and steam reciprocating engine beautifully maintained, Wattle continues in this role, one small link with the bygone age of steam. As well as recording various shipping movements around Port Phillip, the motion picture camera has also captured the range of emotions experienced by those departing or arriving by sea, and by those watching a familiar face disappearing into or emerging from a blurred image of a ship on the bay. These emotions were invariably heightened in relation to the departure from Melbourne of Australian troops en masse for overseas service, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty for all concerned. In terms of mass movement of people, the Port of Melbourne also provided a landing place for the wave of new settlers after the Second World War. Melbourne was a favoured city among the growing migrant community. The large and sudden influx of non-British immigrants in particular representing a dramatic change for an urban population composed almost entirely of people from the British Isles and their descendants. The spectacle of a migrant ship arrival was always good for a story, and the newsreels helped publicise the success of the government's post-war migration schemes. For all that, most of the feel-good migrant arrival coverage tended to focus on British or European subjects. This party of almost 1,000 British migrants arriving at Port Melbourne aboard the Ormonde in 1947 was a record at the time. By November 1955, Melbourne was preparing to welcome Australia's 1 millionth migrant since the war, Barbara Porritt, arriving from Yorkshire with her husband Dennis on board the Aronsay. Attractive newcomers like Mrs. Porritt reinforced the notion of European immigrants as grateful and unassuming.
You know, Dennis and I didn't expect a welcome like this, but we feel that it's not only for us, but for the 1 million new people. I'm very happy to have been chosen to represent these people, but I'm frightened too. But I expect that most migrants feel like myself when they first come, and I guess that it won't last for long in happy Australia.
Our 50,000th Dutch migrant, Maria Scholter, had received similar treatment when she arrived here aboard the Sabayak in July 1954. At a special function to mark the occasion, she exchanged gifts with the beaming Immigration Minister, Harold Holt. 4 years later, the arrival of the 100,000th Dutch migrant, Mrs. Adriana Sevenbergen, aboard the Johan van Oldenbarneveld. She too received red carpet treatment from new Immigration Minister Alexander Downer. Statistics of a different kind for English lass Margaret Jarrett.
The liner Multan arrives in Melbourne, bringing to Australia Miss Margaret Jarrett. The 24-year-old lass from Kent wrote to Sydney's Lord Mayor seeking an Australian husband. Her English boyfriend jilted her, so now she's going to have a look around out here.
Well, Miss Jarrett, there's been a lot of talk in newspapers and that of your opinions on true love. Do you believe in true love?
Oh, yes, I think there is such a thing, but it takes time.
I see. How many letters have you actually had up to date, Miss Jarrett?
Around about 800, I should say.
Well, what do you think of the Australians you've seen up to date, Miss Jarrett?
Well, I haven't seen many, but those that I have seen I like very much.
Oh, glad to hear that, anyway. Well, Miss Jarrett, have you ever regretted writing that first letter to the Mayor of Sydney?
Oh, no, definitely not. I wish I'd thought of it years ago.
Others to arrive in or depart Melbourne by ship were more accustomed to the attentions of news camera operators. Returning aboard Ormond in 1925 were W.A. Gibson and F.W. Thring, after touring the United States, Britain and Europe to secure what they termed the world's best pictures. Australian sports stars were always big news. The return of the 1948 Olympic team from the London Games, no exception.
The liner Strathair arrives from England, bringing 56 members of the Australian Olympic team. And there's an enthusiastic welcome as the ship puts in at Melbourne. With 2 firsts and more minor placings than any other Australian team, they are justified in being proud. And the girls are a credit to their country in performance and in appearance. The men had a fine record too. These are our athletes, wrestlers, boxers, swimmers and water polo team. Australia was 5th among all nations in the unofficial point score. High jump winner John Winter is not on board, nor is star woman athlete Shirley Strickland, who stayed for some weeks in England. But you don't have to be a title winner to get a big welcome back home. Vice President of the Victorian Amateur Swimming Association, Bill French, congratulates Edgar Tanner, the team manager, on its Olympic successes. John Marshall, second in the grueling 1,500-metre swim. Mrs. Millard of the Victorian Ladies Swimming Association has a special welcome for backstroke star Judy Joy Davis. The Games saw the world's outstanding athletes, but Australia's team returned with a fine record.
Heading in the opposite direction aboard Orchides, Australia's 1949 Davis Cup team, Frank Sedgman, Bill Sidwell, manager Cliff Sproul and John Bromwich. In those days, competing for the Cup overseas involved long weeks of sea travel. Other famous arrivals caught on film included Sir Douglas Mawson, who landed at Williamstown in April 1931 after a 2-year expedition to the Antarctic in the vessel Discovery. Philanthropist and expedition donor Sir Macpherson Robertson was dockside to greet the legendary polar explorer.
Well, Mr. Robertson and Sir Masson, we covered 120 degrees of longitude in the pack ice zone, collecting scientific data of all sorts en route, and we have sighted several new lands, added a great deal of new coastline to the map, and completed the detailed mapping of McRobertson Land we found last year.
Among the more exotic arrivals in Bay waters, an Imperial Airways short S-23 flying boat, which moored at Williamstown in January 1938, and more recently, the fleet of tall ships, which spent time at Port Melbourne as part of the Australian bicentennial celebrations, thrilling countless ship lovers drawn like magnets to the eastern coastline to observe both legs of the ship's bay journey. Lone sailors entering Port Phillip Bay, such as British yachtsman Alec Rose, have invariably attracted public interest as well. Rose was filmed in 1967 during his successful bid to sail around the world. But none, it is fair to say, have captured the public's imagination quite like the fearless young sailor Jesse Martin, who in October 1999 returned to a huge welcome at Sandringham after conquering the world's roughest seas all on his own. Martin, on board his yacht Lionheart, had officially broken the record for sailing solo around the world unassisted, a journey of more than 50,000 kilometres. Exhausted from his epic journey, Martin stepped onto dry ground for the first time in 11 months to receive an emotional greeting from his mother. But in the face of this overwhelming public response to his homecoming, he may well have preferred to be still battling the huge swells at sea. Disasters, whether natural or man-made, are always big news, and the Northern Bay area has experienced its share of them over the years. Bayside residents still talk about the infamous cyclone, which struck Brighton on the 2nd of February 1918, the effects of which were recorded in this rare newsreel footage. The cyclone carved 3 distinct paths of destruction as it hit Brighton at a speed of more than 320 kilometres per hour. The rotunda, tea rooms and bandstand at Brighton Beach and Perry's Baths all suffered extensive damage. While Lieutenant Colonel Kendall's residence in Wellington Street was one of many homes to lose roofing or fencing. At Billilla, stone finials on the parapets and tower crashed through the roof. The front entrance was badly damaged and the garden was devastated. The Methodist Church in what was then Mill Street was similarly opened up to the heavens by the destructive force of the cyclone. The building itself still survives, now called the Brierley Uniting Church in Hawthorne Road, Brighton East. Bayside suburbs were also lashed in December 1934 by what was described at the time as the worst gale in Australia's history. The combination of king tide and severe storm activity caused untold damage along the eastern coastline, with the strip between South Melbourne and St Kilda particularly hard hit. Sea bathing establishments had no defence against the pounding waves. The St Kilda Pier fared little better. Retaining walls cracked or were reduced to rubble by the relentless sea assault. Boats slipped their moorings. This 72-foot steam launch had already lost its funnel before being washed up against the sea wall. Residents in nearby streets had minor flooding to contend with. While motorists were reduced to a crawl along Marine Parade, which was almost covered by sand thrown up by the wave action. The pattern of damage and devastation continued around the bay. The Great Storm of 1934 responsible for removing whole sections of beach and severely eroding cliffs. Low-lying regions were soon under feet of water as swollen rivers and creeks broke their banks. The Mordialloc area resembling an inland sea in these dramatic scenes recorded by Sir Frank Richardson. Unseasonally dense fog which hit Melbourne was considered partly attributable for the collision of 2 steamers in Hobson's Bay on the 29th of January 1937. Caradale, bound for Sydney, rammed Kakariki just off the Gellibrand Pile Light at about 11 p.m, but suffered nothing worse than a hole in her bows above the waterline. But Kakariki, struck between the forecastle and the mess room, lost 5 of her crew as the vessel sank within 3 minutes. The wreck lay in 36 feet of water with her funnel, portion of the bridge and mast above water. The Court of Marine Inquiry found that Kakariki was to blame. Apart from the items which were able to be salvaged, she was a total loss. Various attempts to raise the vessel, including a suggestion to use airtight cylinders attached to the sunken hull, were unsuccessful, and she was eventually broken up in the early 1940s. The cargo vessel River Burnett's brush with Corsair Rock also led to her gradual sinking near Frankston, but with no loss of life. The freighter was eventually refloated to a better position and arrived safely back in port at Melbourne on the 17th of July 1955. A side-on view of the ship's hull indicates the high water mark achieved during her near immersion. This vessel seemed particularly blighted, and the crew hung an effigy aloft in a bid to break her jinx. Another well-publicised collision involved HMAS Vendetta. Built and launched in style at Williamstown Naval Dockyard in May 1954, the destroyer, sister ship to the ill-fated Voyager, was still at trial stage when disaster struck.
Australia's newest 10 million pound destroyer Vendetta crashes into Williamstown dry dock, ripping almost through the heavy steel gates. The ship went ahead instead of astern, smashing its bow and tearing a 20-foot hole in both sides. Water pours through the damaged dock gate, threatening the frigate Quick Match, which is in dock with 2 plates removed. The daring-class destroyer is trapped for 5 hours as men with saws, acetylene torches and crowbars cut and chop the twisted wreckage of the dry dock gate. The pride of the Royal Australian Navy is badly damaged and repairs will take weeks. A naval inquiry began immediately into the cause of the freak accident. A dry dock and 2 ships damaged when a brand new destroyer plunges ahead instead of astern on the very day she was to complete her final speed trials.
Collisions aside, for vessels moored in or entering Northern Bay waters, running aground was a real possibility as well. The Tasmanian Star, for example, was stranded near Clifton Springs for 10 days in May 1956. And a sad end for the long-serving Bass Strait ferry Nerana, which in February 1951 broke away from her moorings in a storm and drove ashore between what is now Webb Dock and Garden City. An ignominious demise also for the historic Gellibrand Light, which went up in flames in 1976. Cyclonic storm activity was behind one of the more bizarre shipping disaster stories of the top end of Port Phillip. On the 17th of November 1926, the 940-ton steamship Malaita broke her moorings in Hobson's Bay and was blown into Stubbs Men's Baths opposite Withers Street in South Melbourne. The stricken vessel crashed into the north side of the baths, swung round through the western wall, then demolished the other side. For Tom and Amy Backer, it was an even bigger disaster. In 1926, the St Kilda Baths, where Tom had been employed as a lifeguard for 26 years, were destroyed by fire. Tom and Amy then put all their savings into the South Melbourne Baths, taking over management on the 16th of November, the day before the Malaita demolished them. Subsequently, the backers failed in a court action against the ship's owner for compensation. Tom eventually returned to the rebuilt St Kilda Baths, working there continuously until he turned 90. The Malaita was not refloated until 1927 and eventually scuttled outside the Heads in November 1928. South Melbourne Beach was also the location for another odd salvage operation, in which a boatload of police officers endeavoured to rescue a young bull headed in the general direction of Tasmania. With an audience of around 100 bemused spectators, the police struggled to secure the animal once ashore, only for the bull to slip its rope and break free, scattering the crowd in the process. And again, the frightened beast took to the water. Other beach visitors, however, seem to have more affinity with the foreshore fauna and flora. such as this woman, whose trips to the water's edge at St Kilda were anticipated by hordes of gulls, rewarded for their attentions with a regular feed. And an Inner Bay resident with exotic taste.
On the subject of marine menus, how about this for a vegetarian variety? The newsreel camera was at Middle Park to catch Bert Dean, a 28-years-old Melbourneite, shopping for his breakfast. First, a flagon of tasty salt water. Then a few flotsam-flavoured morsels from the beach, and hey presto, seaweed salad, garnished with a raw egg. And there goes the egg, shell and all. For 5 years, Bert stuck to his sea diet. Never been sick. Amazing. And he's a married man with a wife and 3 squids.
Like the southern Port Phillip area, the top end of the bay is equally blessed with prominent landmarks and picturesque scenery, and as such has proved equally popular with filmmakers in choosing suitable locations to frame their stories. Surviving reels of the silent era biopic of Adam Lindsay Gordon, produced and directed by W.J. Lincoln, include incidents from his time as a trooper in the Australian bush up to his death as a popular but penniless poet. Scenes recorded in the Bayside area include the final tableau, a well-judged long shot of Gordon's lonely figure standing on an empty shoreline. Gordon was played by former stage actor Hugh McRae, himself a poet, who supposedly bore a strong physical resemblance to Gordon. The film ends with a memorial pilgrimage to Gordon's grave in Brighton Cemetery, shot on Sunday the 3rd of September 1916, only a day before the film opened at Hoyt's Olympia Theatre in Melbourne. The short drama Easy Money, produced by members of the Victorian Amateur Cine Society in 1939, makes extensive use of locales in the Black Rock Sandringham area. The story, a variation on the age-old crime doesn't pay theme, was filmed over 4 weekends and centres around Loppy Jones, a no-good drug courier who receives advice that a new shipment has arrived by sea and proceeds to flag down the supplier. In a neat edit, Loppy rows his dinghy from Half Moon Bay and takes receipt of the drug package offshore at Williamstown. On return, Loppy hastens to conceal the package at the base of the cliffs, but is spotted by 3 young women sunbathing further along the beach. When Loppy is out of sight, they decide to investigate. Loppy, meanwhile, is headed for the post office at Sandringham to send a telegram to advise his clients in Chinatown of the new shipment. The post office interior is the VACS rooms in Queensbridge Street, South Melbourne, and the postal official is played by the film's producer and co-cinematographer, Wally Philpott. While Loppy is away, the girls discover and prise open the drug cache, opium, lest we were in doubt, but in actual fact the filmmakers filled the box with packets of Epsom salts. The girls immediately head for the nearest phone box to alert the authorities, and in no time the Department of Justice has a car and 3 officers on hand to effect the drug bust. Loppy returns to collect his hidden case, but is distracted by the party of pursuers, slips, and falls to an untimely end at the foot of the cliffs. In the concluding scene, the department officers give the girls the good news that they are to receive a £50 reward for their role in the drug seizure. Other amateur filmmakers have been attracted to the Half Moon Bay Red Bluff area, including grade 5 and 6 students from Brunswick Southwest Primary School. They visited the Bayside beach location in 1974 to make the short fiction film titled and set in England in the year 939 AD, pier and moored boats notwithstanding. The film tells the story of local resistance to a Viking-style invasion and was written, cast, costumed and constructed by the students themselves. As their teacher, Barry Johnson, explained, the grade consisted of many migrant children with little experience of Melbourne and its environs. Part of the motivation for making this film lay in getting out of the industrial northern suburb and travelling to the beach for a picnic and a good time, which is clearly evident from the pitched battle scenes towards the end of the film. But not all film scenarios were quite as rollicking at this time. In the 1970s, themes of alienation and urban despair were often explored by short filmmakers, and this brief film essay by Martin Bachevsky, Tom Gibson and John Ruane was no exception. The perverse iconography of Luna Park, in turn, made it nearly ideal for filmmakers seeking the ultimate landscape as backdrop. Or, in this case, featuring its thrills and illusions up front as a metaphor for some of the themes being explored. Nighttime shooting at a nearby landmark presented its own set of problems for cinematographer Robin Copping and director Tim Burstall. They had chosen the St Kilda Pier as the location site for the short drama The Hot Centre of the World. From a story by John Powers, this three-hander dramatises the encounter between a would-be suicide and two derelicts, played by Dennis Miller and George Whaley.
I prefer it, a lot of them do. Would myself. Cuts down on the drag. Eh? I want you. What are you on about? You want to rat his pockets. I did not. God. Bloody clobber, you.
Produced by Bilcock and Copping and the Swinburne Film School for the Producers and Directors Guild of Australia, the film features strong performances from all three principals. Peter Cummins performs the third role. His character's bungled suicide attempt carried out in full view of the voyeuristic and conniving vagrants.
Couldn't keep down. I just couldn't.
The Kerford Road Pier in South Melbourne was one of several bay locations chosen as backdrop for scenes in Paul Cox's 1983 feature, Man of Flowers. With the Victoria Hotel also forming part of a dramatic skyline, Yuri Sokol's restless camera settles on the troubled face of life-class model Lisa, played by Alison Best, as she stares out to sea. This shot anticipates the final scene, in which the film's protagonist, wealthy recluse Charles Bremer, played by Norman Kay, is shown in silhouetted solitude, quietly contemplating the bay horizon from the high ground at Point Ormond.
Even flowers have a negative side to them.
The film's exploration of the intersection between life and art culminates in the absurdist climax, in which Bremer is shown admiring the all-too lifelike statue of Lisa's tormentor. Bremer has donated the statue to the local council, which has responded to such generosity by giving it pride of place in Catani Gardens.
Sculpture must be touched. If you can't touch it, it's no good. That's what you said.
In the following year, Paul Cox and his team of collaborators headed across the bay to Williamstown for the filming of his next feature, My First Wife.
How do you feel?
Very delicate, saintly.
You haven't eaten for days.
An intense drama, the film centres around the disintegrating marital relationship between Helen and John, the unhappy couple played by Wendy Hughes and John Hargreaves. The Hargreaves character John is nonplussed by his wife's intention to leave him, and much of the film is based around his tortured journey from grief to indignant rage to tentative reconciliation. The tranquil setting of Hobson's Bay is of little comfort to him, the stately home more like an empty shell and the absence of his wife and young daughter Lucy. But Williamstown locals and other bay watchers would have enjoyed seeing familiar sights and landmarks on the screen, including the key residence itself at number 28 The Strand, between Mariner and John Streets. For filmmaker-artist Maggie Fook, the view from her St Kilda balcony served as inspiration for the 1987 short Pleasure Domes, her series of animated watercolour drawings and hand-coloured copies of photographs giving shape to a reflection on the nature of landscape and the human response to it.
I live in St Kilda. My balcony overlooks the bay. When I look out, especially on summer evenings, I often think this could be anywhere. But I don't really mean anywhere, or even anywhere with a promenade and palm trees around a bay. Only certain kinds of anywhere. Indeed, a Riviera anywhere. Cannes, Nice, Saint-Tropez, Antibes. Quite a particular anywhere.
Another student film to feature the St Kilda foreshore precinct is Headlock, a short drama which begins with the theft of a wallet.
Where's the money? Good girl.
Hey, give me back my wallet! Hey, can you help me? He's got my wallet.
And a chase which ends in the O'Donnell Gardens adjoining Luna Park. An unlikely hero finds himself restraining the mugger in a headlock while they wait for police to arrive. A crowd gathers around to watch, but as day turns to night, there is still no sign of the police. The young woman who is held up leaves the scene in search of the police, a cue for the mugger to begin to prey on the vulnerabilities of his captor.
Rubbish. What appointment could you possibly have at this time of night, you clown?
I'm not a doctor. No, it doesn't matter.
Oh, it matters.
I just need a couple of dollars. My boyfriend is really special.
The film was written, directed and edited by Amanda Brocci, who also managed a brief on-screen appearance as part of the crowd.
Do you have any women friends?
Summer as a child meant the beach. My family rented a bathing box beside Michael's. Michael was my age. We were inseparable. We used to pretend our fathers owned all the bathing boxes. We'd play in the water and tell visiting children. If they were really impressed, we'd invite them in for lemonade. If they disbelieved us, we'd threaten them. We'd call the police if they came too near our bathing boxes.
Brighton's bathing boxes featured in this vibrant realisation by Anne Turner, part of the International Picture House series, in which filmmakers from selected countries produced short films inspired by particular paintings.
Sometimes
Turner's Australian entry cast as its bathing box users Stephen Whittaker, Frances O'Connor and Heather Mitchell. And deftly charts the ebb and flow of summer desire. It was inspired by the Geoffrey Smart painting of the same name, which features at the beginning and the end of the film.
One day there was a new kid, Deirdre Spicer. We ate her apricots and then chucked the stones at her. I hit her on the temple and Michael said I'd give no brain damage. I let Deirdre have my bathing box. She was so excited she stayed inside all day. At sunset, Michael and I would collect empty bottles left by sunbathers. We'd stand in the sea and wash the sand off and imagine sending notes to sad, ugly people marooned on lonely islands. But instead, we'd take the bottles to the local shop and exchange them for mixed lollies we'd share as we walked home.
A summer Bayside holiday is also the basis for the 1998 feature comedy Crackers, written and directed by David Swan, produced by Chris Warner, and principal cast including Susan Lyons, Peter Rosethorn, Daniel Kelly and Christopher Chapman. But for young Joey Dredge, it has all the earmarks of a summer holiday from hell. Joey has been expelled from school after throwing himself off the tuck shop roof again, is haunted by the death of his father, hates his mother's new boyfriend Bruno, and his bully son Angus, and has a hair-raising car journey with the three of them en route to spending Christmas at his grandparents' Bayside home.
What are you doing? You shoot! Get back! Get back! Get back! Come on, let me in! Take it! Get out of here, stupid bitch! I hate Christmas. I hate it.
All looks hopeless until Albert, Joey's long-lost great-grandfather, played by leading international actor Warren Mitchell, appears unexpectedly after a stint in prison and enlists the boy's aid to restore a yacht as a surprise Christmas present for Joey's grandfather. When the work is complete, Joey engineers a secret sailing session with Albert.
Push it away from it. Here we go. All right. Not bad. That's good, Jack.
When their plan is uncovered, the rest of the household is in uproar.
What's your bloody problem, Bruno? Hey, yes. Get the flares out of the car, man. They're in the esky.
Bruno, you head north.
We'll go
Shut up, Jack. We'll go along the coast in the car.
Get the thing in. Get in. There's no time for lovey-dovey. Here's the old man's pills. There. Get going.
Bruno volunteers to rescue the pair, departing in a flurry from the boat ramp at Half Moon Bay and quite unaware that Joey has previously sabotaged his small craft.
Oh! No. I can't.
Are you afraid?
Unable to swim, Bruno appears in grave danger of going down with the ship. Until, ironically, his rescue is effected by Joey, an action which enables various differences to be reconciled by film's end. The rugged Red Bluff area has appeared on film many times over the years. It featured again in this 1953 newsreel, when Estonian-born migrant Peter Pedaja took to its soft sandstone cliff faces with knife and chisel to sculpt a series of impressive figures. Give him time, the original commentary suggested, and he'll give Australia a new coastline. It is unlikely that such work would now be permitted, but even then the Sandringham Council received an objection on the basis that the sculptures destroyed the natural form of the cliffs. Mother Nature, of course, had done her own sculpting of the cliff faces and beaches along the eastern coastline over the years. The giant storm of 1934 in particular causing severe cliff erosion and removal of entire beaches at some points. Man-made structures fared little better. Bluestone seawalls were erected in the 1930s, and later wooden groins, rock breakwaters and so on were tried. But meddling with nature often caused more problems in terms of beach retention than it solved. Hampton Beach, once a favoured resort, had never really recovered from the 1934 storm and subsequent wave erosion. But in September 1997, a giant dredge began moving sand from the seabed. 10 days and 200,000 tonnes later, the transformation was complete. Premier Kennett and a young assistant unveiled a plaque to officially open the resurrected beach. Mr. Kennett was officially presented with a toy duck as thanks for his government's $3 million contribution to the project. Beach reclamation, though, is only one of a number of coastal and marine environmental issues which have arisen in northern Port Phillip over the past decade or so. For Bay authorities, satisfying the needs of the growing number and wide variety of users and interests while monitoring what flows into its waters or is taken out of them has been no easy task. Beachgoers became accustomed to EPA warnings of high E. coli levels and the potential closure of certain beaches over summer, particularly after storm activity. More recent concerns have centred around the dangers posed by discarded syringes on Melbourne beaches, highlighted by the needle stick injury suffered by Ironman Jonathan Crowe while competing at Elwood in January 2000. While the local council defended its beach cleaning procedures, Crowe faced an anxious 3-month wait for HIV and hepatitis B test results.
I just have to wait and see what happens.
Commercial development at the top end of the bay has also become an increasingly thorny issue for local and state government. Community and heritage groups are less and less inclined to accept any change or new development scheme if they feel it threatens any site with recognised social, historical or architectural value. Port Melbourne residents, for example, having witnessed the segmentation of their suburb brought about by the construction of the 4-lane Graham Street overpass and the Westgate Bridge, were unimpressed with the mooted Sandridge project. This development in the late 1980s, early 90s, was geared to take over the beach and foreshore domain, traditionally public land, and construct a canal-based commercial and residential precinct of Gold Coast proportions. Few tears were shed when this grand vision, patently out of tune with the economic times, failed to be realised. But the battle to retain something of Port's original character and tradition had only just begun. For years now, up and down the coast, beach and foreshore development issues have been debated and fought over, and continue to be.
Has anything ever happened in the history of the world that you know of where people haven't complained? Is there?
The battlefront for the most contentious development schemes in the northern half of Port Phillip Bay has invariably been St Kilda. And the battles to preserve particular buildings or sites in this area are almost always protracted. Nowhere was this more evident than in the 7-year struggle to save the run-down block of Art Deco flats on the Upper Esplanade. The Mandalay flats were marked for demolition as part of the same high-rise redevelopment which had already accounted for or threatened other Melbourne icons along this strip. It was the view from the front flat, leased by filmmaker artist Maggie Fook, which gave rise to her short film Pleasure Domes. Now she found herself behind the camera, a major player in her own documentary, recording the struggles of tenants to not only save their homes, but to make a point about social arguments in urban planning, the loss of low-income housing, and its effect upon the community. The residents' Save St Kilda campaign took in several demonstrations, a hearing in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, a union black ban, and numerous discussions, planning and strategy meetings. At the same time, demolition and construction work continued on adjacent sites, and what would become the Novotel Hotel complex took shape. Ultimately, Mandalay was saved from demolition, but for the remaining tenants facing eviction, it was a hollow victory. Renovations, in fact, began before the last tenants had moved out. Aiming her camera for the last time at the new, fully refurbished flats, the filmmaker noted that the asking price for the flat she occupied was a cool $300,000. Her film, however, stands on its own